Relax and listen to the voice. Welcome to Bloody Bits Volume 3, our series that's focused on promoting the works of unknown or underknown authors. Please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification button so that you're made aware whenever new content is put out. Alright, here we go. Premonitions of War. It was October 31st, 1942, and instead of enjoying Halloween festivities with his friends and family back home, Keith was on a boat heading overseas. World War II was in its third year, and the German army, led by their leader, Adolf Hitler, had already taken control of much of the occupied territory in Europe. Private Keith Jackson held onto the side of the ship as it rocked back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. His stomach felt as if it had been churned up in a bucket and then stomped on. Keith had only finished boot camp a week prior, and he was terrified of what he was to face once they reached the North African coast. They reached land on November 7th in the town of Morocco. It was a culture unlike anything he had ever seen. Now occupied by France, the country was filled with Allied forces and refugees from across Europe, many of which were grouped together in abandoned dance halls, which would be considered unsafe by most standards. Morocco had a large slave population as well, something that Keith was against, coming from the northern states. It took all the willpower that he could muster to not react when he saw these slaves being mistreated. His platoon was brought to an Allied base where tents were erected across the vast area that sat atop a hillside. From there, he could see for miles in any direction. It offered a great vantage point for spotting the enemy. Troops marched in and out of the base on a regular basis with their rifles perched at ready over their right shoulders. Many of the local merchants set up carts and makeshift stands outside the base, selling food and local crafts. They wore long white garments that Keith was told were called jalaba, a light-colored robe with a hood. On their heads, they wore a red fez, a cylindrical hat with a black tassel attached to the top, and on their feet, they wore what resembled slippers. Keith had mistakenly assumed that this was their bed attire and laughed when he first spotted them. After being assigned a barracks to sleep in, he was ordered to report to the commanding officer, Colonel Pomeroy, a soldier as tough as they come. His chiseled jaw and muscular physique intimidated Keith slightly. When he spoke, everyone listened. His voice seemed to amplify over the sound of vehicles and the hundreds of soldiers that surrounded them. Colonel Pomeroy notified Keith and the rest of his platoon that they would be shipping out the following day to Algeria, where they would hold the border of Tunisia to the northeast. So much for getting settled in, he thought. After a day of briefing and preparation, Keith was finally able to get some rest. He laid on his cot inside the barracks and tried desperately to get to sleep, but anxiety started to take over his thoughts, and he considered the fact that he may not make it back home. The following morning, his sergeant came into the barracks, blowing a whistle, waking everyone up and ordering them to get dressed and packed up because they were moving out in 15 minutes. Keith jumped to his feet, but was still unsteady after a restless night and nearly toppled over. The sergeant stood at the foot of Keith's cot and barked out orders. Keith hurriedly got dressed, made his bed, and packed his gear. The troop then headed outside, where a truck was waiting to transport them to Algeria. They came to a stop in the town of U.S.A, close to the Tunisian border. A railway ran through the town that carried supplies for the Allies. Keith's troop was ordered to protect the railway at all costs. While making his rounds along the tracks, Keith heard a male voice shouting out his name. At first, he considered it was the dry heat causing him to hallucinate, but then a figure came into view. A man in his early 20s approached Keith with his right hand extended in greeting. Keith recognized him immediately as one of his friends from school, Scott Calloway. "How the heck are you?" Scott asked as he shook Keith's hand vigorously. "Scott, I can't believe it's really you. What are the odds of us finding each other halfway around the world?" "Hey, Keith, after you finish your rounds, I want to introduce you to some of my pals, all right?" "Sure, Scott. Sounds great." As promised, Keith joined his friend after he finished with his duties and was introduced to a group of soldiers from all over the United States, each with their own stories of lives they left behind. "So fellas, I need to tell you a secret about my good friend Keith. Back in our hometown, Keith was known to be something of a psychic. You know, he could predict the future and stuff like that. So anyway, people all over town used to come to him to find out all sorts of things. Like if they were going to find true love or get a job, stuff like that." Keith was annoyed by his friend's candid approach on a subject that Keith would have preferred to keep secret. Sure enough, as soon as the soldiers heard news of this phenomenon, the questions started coming. "It doesn't work quite that way," Keith stated. "I can't just predict things out of the blue whenever I want. I have these dreams that come true most of the time. That's all." The men were disappointed that they couldn't find out about their futures, but at the same time, they were intrigued and slightly spooked out with Keith's gift. It wasn't long before word of Keith's ability spread throughout the camp, and he could hear the murmurs as he walked past the other troops. Even his own platoon started acting strange around him. He soon felt like a freak and an outcast, just like back at home. He thought he could get away from all the back-talking by joining the army, but now it had come back to haunt him. The following morning, Keith woke suddenly, sitting straight up in his bed. The soldier on the cot next to his asked him what was wrong. Keith informed him that he had had a prediction and needed to speak with the commanding officer immediately. Lieutenant Donald Barker, or Bulldog to his friends, allowed time to hear out Keith. The rumors of Keith's predictions had reached him as well, and he wanted to see if there was any truth to it. "Have a seat, Private. I'm told you had something important to tell me, so spit it out already." "Yes, sir. That is, it could be important. I had this dream last night that showed the German forces were going to be moving toward Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. The Allies need to protect us from land and sea if they are to defeat the Nazis in this battle. There will be German U-boats hiding out there somewhere." The lieutenant stared at Keith with an unrevealing look. He stayed silent for a few minutes as he paced the floor behind the table he used for a desk. Keith could hear the sand blowing against the tent walls outside, and a bead of sweat formed on his forehead. Eventually, Lieutenant Barker spoke. "Son, normally I don't give in to this hocus-pocus mumbo-jumbo, but I just got word this morning from a source I have at military intelligence, and he mentioned rumors of German forces headed this way. I'm gonna take a chance and notify the base that they should watch those towns you mentioned. If there's any sign of anything out of the ordinary, I will recommend an aggressive force be put in play." As predicted, the Nazi troops tried to take all 3 of the towns that Keith mentioned, and by the time the battle had ended, the British Army had lost nearly 600 soldiers, the French lost almost 1,400, and the Americans, being led by Major General George S. Patton and Rear Admiral Henry Kent Hewitt, ended up with over 500 dead. During the battle, the Allies captured several German vessels at sea and sunk 8 of the U-boats. The Allies had won. Word of Keith's prediction of the battle reached beyond his Allied base. It soon reached top officials in military intelligence as well. They asked to be kept up to date on any future predictions. Suddenly, Keith was no longer an outcast. Everyone wanted to shake the hand of the man that turned the war around. The next prediction did not happen until February of 1943. Keith saw that the next battle would take place in the Atlas Mountains in west-central Tunisia at a place called Kasserine Pass. This 2-mile-wide pass between the mountains was host to a fierce battle. The Allied forces, consisting of the United States, Free France, and the United Kingdom, fought over a 50-mile stretch against the German Panzer Division and the Italian Centauro Armored Division. Tanks fired off shells in all directions as troops tried to gain ground on foot. The inexperienced American infantry suffered terrible losses at the hands of their enemy by the time it ended. 3,300 soldiers were killed or wounded, including Keith's friend Scott, who took a bullet to the head. In total, there were more than 10,000 casualties, but with the help of the British forces, they were victorious. Keith had been promoted twice by the end of the battle, and was now a corporal. His fear had been replaced with a dark entity that seemed to be filling his mind with hatred for the enemy. He was no longer the timid young boy from Nebraska. Now, he was a killer of men. He was completely desensitized. The predictions continued, and his fame within the Allied forces continued to spread worldwide. Even the enemy began to speak of this young man that predicted the battles. During the next several months, he led Allied victories in Sicily, then Italy, and then a major battle in Normandy, France, between June 6th and June 24th of 1944. 1,200 planes led an airborne assault on German-occupied France, while over 5,000 military personnel led an amphibious assault from the English Channel onto Juno Beach and 4 other beaches along the coast. 13 Allied countries joined the fight against the Germans and Italians. By the time the battle ended, both sides had suffered over 200,000 casualties, but once again, the Allies were victorious, shooting down more than 2,000 of the enemy aircraft and destroying around 2,000 or more tanks. The Allies continued to run the enemy forces out of France and kept pushing them back, first through the Netherlands and then across the German border. Keith's predictions had all come to fruition, and he received a letter from Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, commending him on using his gift for the cause. He even recommended Keith as a Medal of Honor recipient. His next prediction showed he and his fellow brothers in arms going back home. He woke with a sense of hope. On April 30th, 1945, Word came over the wire that Adolf Hitler had committed suicide, sensing an impending defeat. It was May 8, 1945, and word of a complete surrender traveled worldwide. The war was over, and the Allies had won. Keith and his platoon were finally heading back to the United States. They hitched a ride on one of the Navy's light cruisers and were just outside Plymouth, England, on the edge of the Celtic Sea, when a series of explosions took place. The ship had struck several mines hidden near the surface of the water. The ship quickly began to take on water, and all crew was ordered to abandon ship. Keith scrambled to find himself a life preserver, but none could be found. The ship started to capsize, and Keith found himself toppling uncontrollably over the edge of the port side and into the icy water below. As he surfaced, Keith looked up to see the ship plummeting down upon him, and all he could think of was that this was the first prediction he had ever had that did not come true. Coward. Did you hear that? Her whisper cut through the silence like a cold knife. I shook my head, despite her being unable to see me. We couldn't see anything through the heavy darkness. Once surrounded by the constant buzz of electricity, the city now sat still, silent. I peeked out the windows over the helpless city. A chill swept over my skin as I stared out at the vastness. Skyscrapers that once shone like a beacon were now shadows against the stars in the sky. I tried to focus my eyes on the street below, but the moonlight would not reach there. And that is when I heard it. The sound of a pair of feet sprinting down the hall towards us. The steady pounding on the tiled floor seemed to echo down the hall until they must have been right outside the door. I held my breath, clamping my hand over my mouth, hoping that it would block the sound of fear that was choking me. It squeezed my throat until I felt like I would be consumed by the darkness that surrounded me. The things we saw before the lights went out were terrifying. The videos uploading faster than they could be censored or concealed. Men and women crazed in the streets that surrounded us now. A disease or infection that turned the blood in their veins black. Their blood would flow from their nose and their eyes until they lost their minds completely. The people with the virus turned evil and unreachable. They would turn on anyone near them, turning common objects into brutal weapons, meanwhile keeping a smile on their lips with a chilling laugh. Some would sing, where others would scream, seemingly lost in rage. Outside, bright flashes lit the street below. The sound of gunshots rang out, bouncing among the buildings. I jumped when something slammed into the door of our apartment. Aaliyah let out an involuntary shriek before I felt her hand wrap around my forearm. It hit the door, once, twice. The third time sent a crack down the middle. I fought against the darkness, looking for anything that could be used to protect us. I reached out blindly, finding the lamp from the side table. Gripping the cold metal like a bat, outstretched in front of me, when the door banged open, ripped from the hinges. I no longer felt my fear as adrenaline flooded my veins. I didn't notice my tremble or feel Aaliyah's nails digging into my arm. I could see its shadowed figure racing across the living room, as if it knew where we stood before even reaching our front door. Grunting, I brought the lamp up and brought it back down on its head. It dropped to the ground with a hard thunk. I stepped back, bumping into Aaliyah, nearly tripping over her as I heard a deep, guttural chuckle. 10, 9, 8. It began counting through a low, hoarse voice. Aaliyah cried out again, still blocking my path as I attempted to put more distance between us and that thing. The only light came from the moonlight that poured through the open windows. I watched in horror as it began to rise again, continuing to count down, its face twisted in the faint light, dark blood shimmering down its face. 4, 3, 2. It paused on 1 as I leapt over the couch, scrambling to my feet as I ran. I ran as fast as I possibly could, my false bravado leaving me as swiftly as it came. A sob choked in my throat as I heard Aaliyah's scream slice through the night, this time dripping in pain. However, I couldn't stop running. I rounded the corner into the hallway and ran until I reached the stairway. The last thing I heard was Aaliyah's voice screaming my name as the heavy metal door slammed shut between us. I couldn't comprehend what was happening to us, that any of this could possibly be real, that I had left my partner of 2 years, left her to the terror in what was once our happy home only hours before. My brain couldn't comprehend any of it. All it could do was focus on taking one step at a time down the steps. My only guide in the complete darkness was the railing scraping across my palm. My ears reached out, listening, but the only sound was my bare feet hitting the metal stairs. Finally, I reached concrete that I knew was ground level. I rushed over, my body slamming into the door, shoving it open as I emerged onto the street. My eyes adjusted in time to see silhouettes rushing towards me.
There he is!
A woman's voice scratched out from my left. I turned right and continued my sprint. I skidded to a stop when a figure emerged from the building a few feet in front of me. The moonlight lit him, revealing a smile stretching across his warped face. I turned and ran into an alley which seemed to stretch on and on. I could hear their footsteps pressing closer behind me, their taunts reaching my ears. My breath was labored, but I didn't dare slow down to even glance over my shoulder. Gunshots rang out again a few streets away, and I found myself again wishing that I owned one. Maybe if I did, Aaliyah would still be with me and we would be safe. I was nearing the end of the alley, the street illuminated in front of me. A hand reached out from behind a dumpster as I passed, grabbing my leg in a death-tight grip. I fell hard, my face slamming onto the pavement. Blood immediately began pouring from my nose and a deep cut along my forehead. However, I couldn't feel it. I couldn't feel anything other than the intense terror that seized my body and mind. I struggled to my feet, kicking at the hand that still held tight. Gaining my footing, I began to run again. My vision swayed and blurred, but I kept running, because there was nothing else left to do. I held no weapon, and I had no plan. That is when the outline of a man stepped out into the opening of the alley in front of me. I tried to rush past him, but his full force slammed into me. My body smacked against the brick wall, and I returned to the cold pavement that I had just risen from. I attempted to rise again, when something hit me hard over the head, slamming me back down to the ground. My vision began to darken as I felt hands grip my ankles and begin roughly dragging me back into the shadows of the alley. I knew that this was the end. I've met death as I had always lived my life, a running coward. And that is where the darkness found me, consumed me. The Morning Star. My husband lies in the hallway as a mangled corpse, and only I would ever know why. It is with this morbid knowledge that I am sitting here now, against the wall, preparing to blow my brains out from fear that I should meet the same fate as him. It was April 8th, the day of the solar eclipse. My husband, John, myself, and our dog, Edgar, sat on the hill behind our house. Edgar chewed happily at a stick he had found, while John and I sat on 2 lawn chairs we brought to this secluded hill in our backyard. It was one of the things that made it so nice living so remote. The stark lack of other people around made our little eclipse party that much more special, as if it were a private phenomenon where the only invites were sent to us 3 here. John sighed and let out a short raspberry. "Well," he said coolly as he took off his eclipse glasses, "I'm gonna get started on some burgers. I think I'll grab a beer too. You want one, babe?" I didn't turn to face him, but instead kept the glasses over my eyes as I said, "I'm fine, thanks." I leaned my head back with a content smile on my face as I heard the familiar sound of an aluminum can being cracked open, shortly followed by the smell of charcoal on the portable grill John brought with us. "You know, you should give your peepers a break. Even with those glasses, I don't think you should look up there for more than a few minutes at a time," my husband crooned. I waved a hand carelessly in his direction. "I'll be fine, grill boy," I mused. "You just worry about getting my lunch going." He chuckled and then asked Edgar, "What about you, bud? You want a beer? A burger?" In response, the dog made his stereotypical sound that indicated both mild excitement and contentment, a mellow and a handful of little wags of his tail. I turned my head around and flicked my glasses down to look at my husband. "If you give my dog beer, I'll turn you into a burger," I said in a jeer. He laughed and shrugged at me, and I couldn't help but smile at him before turning back to return to my lean into the lawn chair. As I resituated myself and leaned back in my chair, I noticed something extraordinary in the sky besides the total eclipse. "Babe, look, there's something in the sky," I excitedly cried to my husband. I didn't realize the effect this would have on John as he looked up at the sky. I knew instantly that he had temporarily blinded himself by looking up at the eclipse without the glasses. He then stumbled and stuck his hand on the heated grill. "Fuck!" he yelled out. "Babe!" I yelled as I stood up and rushed to his side. John was holding his right hand with its reddish skin up while using his left hand to massage his eyes. "It's fine," he said with a pained chuckle. "I just messed myself up a little." I softly grabbed his right wrist and pulled the hand to me. "It doesn't look too bad," I said, "but it's going to need to be iced ASAP." I looked up at him. He was looking at me, blinking rapidly. I think I'm okay," he mumbled through a grin. "Sight's coming back. I know they said not to look at an eclipse, but I didn't know it would be that quick. Thank gosh I looked away, huh?" I laughed and hugged him. He hugged me back, saying, "So what did you see, anyway?" But as he finished his sentence, there was a loud crash behind him, causing tremors in the ground all around us. He whirled on his heel to face the direction of the crash, his arm instinctively held out in front of me. Still frantically blinking his eyes, John moved towards the small crater that was not there mere moments before. He leaned over the edge, almost whispering, "Wow, holy shit." Tentatively, I moved to his side and looked down. There sat a small rock, glowing a strange, ominous emerald green as smoke rose from the heated, porous stone. Edgar growled hesitantly at it as John leaned forward towards it.
What are you doing?
I hissed at him.
Get away from it!
Before my words registered to John, he had already reached out, oddly with his already burnt hand, and touched it. He instantly pulled it back with a disgruntled yipe and stuck his fingers in his mouth.
"Oh, it's hot,"
he said around his fingers.
"No shit, it's hot, John,"
I scolded him.
"I'm pretty sure it just plummeted through the atmosphere, so yes, it's fucking hot."
John only chuckled again, like he almost always does, as he backed away from the rock in the small crater. You said what? You saw something in the sky?" I followed him away and said,
"Yeah, it looked like a meteor or something."
John twisted his face in a thoughtful look, already ignorant of the burning sensation in his hand. "Oh, yeah. I think I read something about a rare comet that's visible at the same time as this eclipse. Comet 12 Pons Brooks, I think. Also, it's called the Devil's Comet because it looks like it has horns." I looked down at the rock in the crater and asked, Did this come from the Devil's Comet?" I looked up at him, my eyes clearly worried. "It's possible, but it's probably unlikely," he said with a shrug. "Comets are mostly ice, not like meteors full of rock, you know?" Pulling at his shoulder, I said, "Well, whatever it is, let's get you back home to ice your hand. We'll have burgers for dinner." John's hand had been iced with a healing ointment generously lathered all about it. We had those burgers we talked about for dinner, and now we lay in our bed. "It's just a cut," John muttered as he inspected his hand. Though the entire bottom side of his hand had been scorched, he was focused on one small cut on the tip of his pointer finger where he had touched the fallen rock from space. "But it burns." He said this last word with an irritated growl. I was happily enjoying being partway through Dean Kuntz's The Watchers and eagerly wanted to finish this paragraph at least, but my husband's constant going on about his hand disturbed my reading. I put the book down with a sigh. "Well," I said heatedly, "maybe you shouldn't have touched the meteor." "Comet," he corrected, and then with a frown added, "I think. Besides, I still hold that it's your fault I put my hand on the entire grill." "It's not," I retorted. "But even if it was, you're not complaining about the full burn, are you? It's just that little cut on your finger, the finger that touched the comet, which was entirely your fault." John made to give some smart remark back. I could tell from the grin spreading on his face, but I leaned in and kissed him before a word could escape. "But I think we should get some sleep. I think it would do you and your healing hand some good." I looked up and smiled at him, and his grin grew wider before he kissed me in return. "That's a good idea," he mused. He turned over to turn off the lamp on his nightstand and rolled back over to hold me in his arms, as we do every night, as it's the most comfortable for both of us. Not long after, we were both asleep. I don't know how much time had passed after that. All I knew was I woke up in pitch blackness, and I saw the light underneath the bathroom door, and I heard the sink running. "Baby?" I said in a dreamy state. "Are you okay?" Silence for a while. Then the sink turned off, and John said in a groggy, scratchy voice, "It's just a cut, but it burns." I got out of bed and walked towards the bathroom door. The door swung open by John's hand, and when I saw him, I screamed. I screamed and howled and sobbed at the sight before me. There, John stood in the doorway. The small cut on the finger of his hand had swelled to at least 4 times his finger width and had spread up his arm, growing thicker as it went up. It overlapped his bicep until it flooded his neck, the swollen and pustulated meat throbbing almost a foot into the air, forcing his head to crook to the side in an unnatural state as he looked at me almost upside down. His right eye had become milky, almost ethereal. That side of his face throbbed with aggressive tendrils of blood-poisoned veins. Through the horror of it all, John smiled at me. That same, it's-all-good smile that he had given me for 5 years of marriage. "Babe," he said in that same scratchy voice, which still held his usual calm demeanor. "I think I'm unwell." He reached his swollen, pus-dripping arm towards me, and I howled in fear again. In my panic, I turned and ran from our master bedroom, down the hall, and towards John's personal office. I slammed the door of the study behind me. "Honey," John said as he gently rapped on the door, "I think we should talk." I dragged John's chair across the floor and shoved it under the door handle. I didn't know if it would really work, but it was the best solution that I could think of. Not that I would ever know. The door handle never rattled. The pounding on the door, however, became more rapid and more intense until it sounded as if John was punching the door with all of his might, over and over. Bang! 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 Yet his voice kept that same sweet, calming tone. "Honey!" Bang! "I think something's wrong." Bang! "I think we should talk about this, babe." Bang! 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 "Honey!" John yelled. Now the sweetness from his voice had gone. Now he sounded like something hungry, something furious, something that wanted to hurt me. "Open the door, babe!" Still, the doorknob never rattled, though the door had begun to splinter. "Boom!" Frantically, I tore through John's various drawers of his desk until I found what I was looking for, his 6-shooter revolver. I pulled it. "Babe, what are you doing in there?" John yelled. I checked the chamber and saw that it was fully loaded with all 6 rounds. As I closed the chamber, the banging and the yelling abruptly stopped. I stood motionless, listening and waiting, but nothing followed. Gingerly, I moved the chair from the door and waited again. Still nothing. I opened the door slowly with soft creaks. I looked down and was reminded of a scene not too long before John and I went to our bedroom. Before even when I put the cream on John's hands. I was reminded of when John held Edgar's head between his hands, and with the hand with the little burning cut, he rubbed Edgar's head a little closer to his mouth, which Edgar then licked fiercely while John told Edgar what a good boy he was. And now I saw John lying motionless on the floor, his chest not rising or slowing with breath, but sitting completely still. His face held the same "it's all good" smile, while his eyes, both the still good one and the seemingly dead one, felt as if they were locked directly on me. Below this face, however, was Edgar, who was eagerly chewing through the abdomen of John. I saw around the hallway that wherever John's blood had been sprayed or spilled, a hideous green fungus grew strikingly fast from the spilled fluid and reached greedily towards the sky, growing at a noticeably fast rate.
Eddie?
I said in a weak, softened voice. The dog ceased its elated chewing in my husband's chest, lifted its head, and turned to face me. Getting a fuller image of Edgar, I saw that the side of the skin on his belly had fallen away, revealing the circuitous organs within his own stomach that thrummed systematically when a chunk of John's flesh moved downward through the organic material. Edgar's head looked up at me, and he acted in such a way that was so casual, so in the norm for the creature, that he said, and gave the same handful of little wags of his tail. As his body vibrated with this mildly excited wag, Edgar's right eye popped out of its socket and hung haphazardly from the slim bit of tendon that still held its connection to the brain. A choked sob escaped my throat, and with trembling hands I raised the six-shot.
"Oh, babe, don't,"
John's corpse said. It was then that I learned that his dead for which they were, eyes were actually following me.
"Don't hurt our baby."
I wish I would have said something, anything at all, in case there was anything left of my husband in there. But I said nothing. I could think of nothing to say. I saw the gaping chasm in my husband's chest, and I knew that whatever was speaking was not John. I fired. The round hit John in the forehead, leaving a clear circle, but exploding a cryptid green matter from the back of his head, which I knew was not natural. The spatter of blood from the back of his head twisted and contorted, and the backwards parts of my brain were reminded of a YouTube video I saw once where someone was showing basic science and held a magnet towards liquid mercury to make it dance. John's blood looked like that, though to what external pole the blood was reaching toward, I could not say. John's head slumped back, retaining its innocent, pure grin. But at this, Edgar turned his head once more to me and began to snarl.
"Eddie,"
I whimpered.
"Eddie, no."
Edgar leapt at me, jaws snapping wildly like a wounded animal, which, I suppose, he was. He dropped me to my back, with my forearm held against his throat, keeping his wild snapping from tearing apart my face. Edgar's zombified claw scratched my forearm, and I fired the revolver 2 times. The first shot missed, penetrating the hallway wall, but the second shot hit his temple. Edgar slumped lifelessly against my body. I rolled the dead dog off of myself and sat up. I pressed my face close to my knees and began to weep. Then I began to hear a strange creaking, as if something were slowly moving towards me. I looked up and saw that same creeping fungus from my husband's brain, though now it was all around me, quickly growing closer to me, across the floorboards and along the walls. I fired a shot at the fungus, only after seeing it explode, to witness it grow faster than before. Again I shot at it, and again it regenerated faster than it was originally spreading across the room towards me. I don't know if it was some divine providence or the force of some twisted malice, but I was able to recall just then that the gun had only one round left in it. I watched as this creeping green fungus reached ever closer towards me. I heard them as they grew closer. I heard my husband John calling for me to come and check out something cool that he had just found. I heard my dog Edgar yowling for food or whining for pets and companionship. I heard every word by John and every distinctive sound by Edgar in the fungus. I studied the laceration on my forearm.
It's just a cut,
I said with a defeated snarl. I studied the laceration on my forearm, which was caused by Edgar, and felt its sting. The horribly gruesome sting from just this small cut in my skin, and how it could feel so otherworldly wrong. The pain in it was growing. It was a pain I had never felt before in my life. The intense heat and fire of it. I pulled the hammer back on the revolver.
But it burns.
Homewrecker. No, she isn't my daughter, he corrects a colleague. She's my wife. On cue, I beam at my husband, innocent and doe-eyed, like I did in my 20s when he was in his 40s. His friend invariably elbows him, making comments about cradle robbing and spring chickens. We laugh. I say something clever in reply, and his companion looks surprised.
And she's witty, too.
My cheeks hurt in an attempt to hold a smile. They continue to talk like I'm not there, but my husband reaches out for my hand. Above all, we are the dearest of friends. But in public, I remain silent. Silence is expected of younger wives, but trust me, I have plenty to say to his ogling peers and their stink-eyed wives, unhappy women stuffed into spandex. A decade or two younger than they are, I want to say that I'm not some trophy that my husband picked up along the way to the corner office. We met like they did. Phone calls, first dates, long romantic weekends. His business associates' wives often assume that I lurked by the photocopier after hours, beguiling a hard-working family man, using the currency of youth to pry my husband from the steely grip of an imaginary wronged wife. What I want to say is that I am my husband's first wife, my husband's only wife. Because of a quarter-century age difference, they assume I am a homewrecker. What disappoints them is that for over 20 years, I've been a home builder, as faithful and as loyal as their husbands pretend to be. They assume my husband has children from a previous marriage, lost souls now bouncing from house to house in a never-ending custody dispute. They feel sorry for his fictitious children. All those missed soccer games, unseen plays on opening nights, dirty gym uniforms left at the other parent's home. Doesn't she know how much psychological damage she's causing his offspring? What I want to say is that my husband is childless by choice. And due to our age difference, he's made that choice for me, too. The decision not to have children at the time we married seems plausible. We are involved in so many things that missing the pitter-patter of little feet doesn't matter much. Surely I can nip my need to nurture by the pitter-patter of puppy paws. This plan worked well in my 30s. Cliché as it sounds, my rescue dogs rescued me, adding a new level of unconditional love and entrance into a welcoming community. I've become a fixture at the dog park, the veterinarians, and the neighbors, apologizing for my dogs digging holes under the fence. But in my 40s, I drop off my nephews and nieces after a day with their fun aunt, waving as they open the door to their cluttered and chaotic homes. My house is spotless, aseptic, quiet. Whenever I see a long table in a restaurant filled with generations of well-wishers, babies held by doting grandmothers, aunts leaning over to tussle a beloved nephew's hair, I make an excuse and we leave. My husband doesn't understand, thinking that I don't want to eat with so much noise and commotion nearby. The problem is that I do, but I want our noise, our commotion, our extended family that isn't. Not the silence of two people with precious little to talk about, except for how the scallops were undercooked. People often ask us how we met. I understand the subtext. I know what they're really asking. Is your wife a gold digger? Does she have daddy issues? Did she lose a bet? What I want to say to them is that I met my husband on the subway. It was, and still is, love at first sight. I still swoon when I see my husband pull his car into the driveway. It thrills me to no end to see his blue eyes twinkle when I walk by, his hands tracing my backside when he brushes past. I do love him, but these days I'm afraid to go to sleep. Now, in his early 70s, my husband seems to age overnight, exponentially so. Each day brings a new pain, new ache, new symptom. His left hip hurts. His cholesterol is running high, even though we have cut out red meat and cheese. He needs a stronger prescription for his eyeglasses. Bifocals, trifocals, now multifocals. More of his teeth need crowns. The crowns he has need root canals. I spend a lot of time at the pharmacy. With so many new medications, I buy him a pill organizer, since neither one of us can keep up. I pick up his high blood pressure medication along with my birth control pills. And his hair, God, his hair. At first, the gray around his temples looks distinguished, like a university professor. Even when he becomes a silver fox, he turns heads. But in his late 60s, his hairbrush is full of fine white hair as his pale, pink pate pokes through what had once been a forest of thick, black curls. Every new change acts as a harbinger, a warning that time is a non-negotiable asset, a message that I'll most likely spend my golden years alone. I kiss him on his bald head when I crawl into bed, earlier and earlier in the evening, otherwise he'll fall asleep on the couch. It's fine. I like to read, reassured by his presence next to me, his light, rhythmic snoring. When I finish a chapter, I look over at him. His mouth is open, chin buried into the folds of his saggy neck. He's pale in this light, hands laying lightly on his chest that rises and falls with his shallow breathing. I find myself crying. There's no reason for it. We aren't promised anything more than this moment. There's no reason for me to cry. Except, when you marry an older man, you don't realize that one day you'll be married to an old man. Inevitably, that day comes, far too soon. No, he wasn't my father. I correct a nurse.
He was my husband.
And there we have it, Bloody Bits Volume 3. We'd like to give a humongous thank you to all the authors that allowed us to read their stories. Please check the video description to find links to the authors of these stories. We hope that you follow them through the provided links and enjoy their other surely fantastic works. Alright, take care of yourselves. Sweet dreams.